ready to take your seats. We'll be beginning our evening with Brooke Goldstein in a few moments. Normally, I would invite you to take your cell phones and put them away, silence them, but I'm actually, in just a moment, going to ask you to take your cell phones out. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Rabbi Josh Bennett. On behalf of all of the clergy here at Temple Israel, Rabbi Harold Loss, Rabbi Paul Yedwab, Rabbi Marla Hornston, Rabbi Jennifer Kaluzny, Rabbi Jennifer Lader, Cantor Neil Michaels and Cantor Michael Smolash, Rabbi Ariana Gordon, we thank you all for being here for one of the most important nights of the year. Tonight is going to be an incredible evening. We hope that you will learn, we hope that you will become motivated, and that you will be able to follow the motto of Temple Israel, which is to make a difference in the world. You'll be given some specific ways to do that. And I want to begin with something that's actually not on topic right now, but you all received as you came in a card. On one side of the card, you see Brooke Goldstein's picture and a QR code that you can use your phones during the evening to ask questions. So you can go use your phone to enter that QR code. It'll bring you to the web, and you can find a form where you can submit questions, and in the question and answer session later on, you'll be able to have your voices heard. But if you flip to the other side, you'll see both the logo that you see on the screens right now and another logo underneath a podcast graphic. I want to tell you about, just for a moment here, an election that you've never heard about. It's the election for the World Zionist Congress, which is the voice of the Jewish community for $1 billion of philanthropy for those of us who live outside of the land of Israel. In Israel, members of the Israeli society vote for the Knesset, and they are, like in the United States, the government spends the taxpayers' dollars. But for all of the philanthropy that comes from outside of Israel, those dollars are motivated and determined by those of us who choose to be a part of the World Zionist Congress. 50 years before the State of Israel was created, Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, had a dream of an Israeli state, but also of a world Jewish community that would support that Zionist dream. He called that Congress, that group of people, the World Zionist Congress, and about almost to the date, 50 years later, the State of Israel was born. And now, in the year 2025, every 5 years, there's an election for members of the world Jewish community who will go to Jerusalem and help to determine how that $1 billion of Jewish philanthropy is spent for the Jewish people in Israel. If you go to that QR code tonight, you'll pay $5, which is just a registration fee so that the election can be administered. And you can pick one of 23 slates that represent a variety of different attitudes towards the State of Israel. We hope, because you're here tonight in Temple Israel, that you will support Rabbi Marla Hornston and I. We are delegates for the Reform movement to make sure that the voice of the Reformed Jewish world is heard in Israel, that liberal Judaism is supported, that pluralist Judaism is supported, and mostly that the Jewish people are supported in democracy in the land of Israel. If you care about any of those things, we encourage you to vote for Reform. It's slate number 3. And if you're still confused, you can go to the last of 3 QR codes under the podcast that says, Waking Up to Life, 18 Minutes with Rabbi Josh. That's me. That's a podcast created here at Temple Israel. This is a special episode, exactly 18 minutes long, with Rabbi Josh Weinberg, who is the Reform Movement's Executive Vice President for Israel Affairs. It's a conversation where we talk about the election in a little bit deeper manner, and we'll give you everything you need to know to understand the World Zionist Congress, to understand the import of this particular election, and hopefully to support Rabbi Marla and me so that we can go to Jerusalem on your behalf in November to vote as a part of the World Zionist Congress to support Jewish values here and abroad. So, with that, please take time tonight after the program to vote. Tell all of your friends to vote. Let us know that you have voted. But that's not why you're here. You are here for Brooke Goldstein, and it is an honor to invite the immediate past president of Temple Israel, Joe Begelman, to come forward to introduce our program tonight.
All right. I am so excited to see all of you and can't wait for you to hear Brooke. I want to just start off by, first of all, thanking my grandfather-in-law, Saba. We started the Miriam and Dr. Isaac Bar Israel Education Fund about 4 or 5 years ago. Really started it with the intention of celebrating the Israel in Temple Israel. Started it with the goal of really educating the community, making sure that every one of us knew the history of Israel, what it means to be a Zionist, what it means to be Jewish, what it means to really understand the history in Israel, the conflicts in the region, and to be able to talk about it intelligently with a friend that really doesn't understand what's going on. We saw anti-Semitism coming from Europe, hot and heavy, and we wanted to, get that knowledge base out because we figured if we're knowledgeable about it and we're talking to somebody who doesn't know about the conflict in the region, that you have a chance to change somebody's mind. Feel strongly about that. Now, we brought in some amazing speakers. Our rabbis and cantors have done an amazing job with education, and hopefully you've been a part of that. If you haven't, we have things on recording. Just ask, we'd be happy to show it to you again. Being Jewish or being part of our community or being a Zionist or being in support of Israel was never political to us. It was always just being Jewish. And, we brought in speakers like Barry Weiss, who's become world-renowned. We've brought in speakers like Noah Tishby, Professor Vic Lehrman at the University of Michigan, all to educate everybody on what was going on. This was all prior to October 7th. October 7th was obviously a major change, obviously has affected all of us and opened our eyes to really what's happened with anti-Semitism around the world. It's blown up huge. It's like a bucket of cold water being poured on your head. So when our TI for Israel committee got together, we were like, all right, could we bring somebody in here to educate us still on what's going on? But we all know what's going on. We've all had that knowledge base. But we wanted to bring in somebody different, somebody that actually could give you actionable items to take to support being Jewish, to support our rights. And that's where we get to Brooke. And, Alicia Goldman, who's our program director, told me a really cute story this morning. She said that she was telling her daughter who we're bringing into Temple tonight, and she explained it as our very own Queen Esther is coming to Temple tonight, and she is fighting for our rights. And I thought that was so cute, and I wanted to share it tonight. And I'll tell you a little bit about Brooke. Brooke is wearing a cape under her jacket. She is very young to have done what she's actually done. So she has not only written a book and is on her second book that comes out next year. She's directed a film. She has started End Jew Hatred on social media. I'm sure you've all seen that and what it's doing on social media and grassroots campaign. She is the founder of the Lawfare Project, which she'll tell you, I'm sure, a little bit more about it, but it is amazing what they're doing and who they're representing. Not only college students who are being discriminated against, professors. In Amsterdam, after the pogroms, the Jews in Amsterdam she's representing. People all over the world. She's getting pro bono work from all these amazing attorneys to help out our cause. I'm so excited for her to share more about it. But get behind her cause because it's something actionable. It's not just you or me posting on social media to your friends about that you support Jews. What are we going to do as a community to get together and actually stand up and fight? And she's going to give you some ways to do that. So without further ado, our very own modern-day Queen Esther, Brooke Goldstein.
Thanks. I think I'm mic'd up here. Well, now I'm nervous, because now I have to live up to what was a really kind and generous introduction. It's really an honor to be here. It's a privilege to be here and to address you all. I don't take it lightly. And I want to thank Joe for being such a good friend within the last 24 hours and picking me up from the airport and making sure that this event happened. And obviously, his grandfather by marriage, whose name is Dr. Isaac Bar. Where is Dr. Isaac Bar? Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm grateful. I also want to make special mention of State Senator Tice, who has passed for the last 2 years on April 29th, a proclamation declaring April 29th a day to end Jew hatred, and for that we are extraordinarily grateful. So I thought that it would be most appropriate really just to use this opportunity to tell a story. To tell the story of how I got to where I am today, which was by no means a straight path. And to get to the point where I am now running the world's foremost Jewish civil rights litigation fund and public interest law firm. And I also run a network of over 800 lawyers. I just want to make, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback and echo. That's a bit distracting for me. Thank you, thank you. So I run the Lawfare Project. I'm also the founder of the End Jew Hatred movement, and I run a network of over 800 lawyers and 37 major law firms that have dedicated themselves to providing pro bono legal support to Jewish communities around the world. Within the last 8 years, we have filed over 180 seminal civil rights cases on behalf of the Jewish community. And just this past year, we have donated over $10 million of pro bono legal support to Jewish communities around the world. And I'm very proud and honored to serve in this role. But if you would have asked me while I was in my first year of law school if this is what I was going to do, that wouldn't have been my guess. In fact, I was studying to become an entertainment lawyer. And I ended up having my first jobs in the entertainment field. I worked at Court TV, I worked at InStyle Magazine and Time Magazine, I worked at small film production companies, and I did all of my internships because that's the type of law that I wanted to go in, entertainment law. And I was in my second year of law school, and that's when you get to take elective courses. So I ended up choosing a course that was called Human Rights and the Child. And in that course, we were learning about all of the international treaties and conventions that make up the body of law that codifies the right of the child, the right of a child to an education and media free of incitement to hatred and violence. And this applies obviously to every child, regardless of their race, ethnicity, their national origin, their background. And we were tasked with writing a thesis on the subject. And I came home one day and I turned on the TV and I still didn't have the subject for my paper. And broadcast before me was an image of a 15-year-old physically handicapped, rumored to be mentally handicapped Palestinian Muslim child named Hussam Abdo, with live explosives strapped around his waist and his arms in the air. And he was turning around for the international media to film him as a robotic arm came to cut off what was a suicide belt. Now it turns out that this 15-year-old handicapped child, and this is in 2004, by the way, this 15-year-old child had been recruited just 48 hours earlier by the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, a designated terrorist organization. He was paid the equivalent of $20 to take his own life. The Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades used another child from his school to recruit him. They drove him to the checkpoint, the Hawara checkpoint, which was just outside of Nablus, and they instructed him to blow up amongst the Palestinians waiting online to get into Israel. But fortunately for those Palestinians, and obviously for the IDF soldiers who were guarding that checkpoint, this handicapped, marginalized, teased, abused child turned out to be smarter than the adults who recruited him because he chickened out. He chose life over death. He was subsequently arrested. He was, by the Israelis, He was charged and convicted of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 8 years in the Hasharon prison about 25 minutes outside of Jerusalem. Now, as a young law student, it occurred to me that there was a legal argument here that his defense team was not making. And that is that the child suicide homicide bomber, similar to a child soldier in Africa, let's say, is a victim of a human rights crime. In fact, the illegal state-sponsored recruitment and indoctrination of Muslim children towards violence is one of the greatest crimes against humanity, because it destroys the future, not just of that child, but of the society. If you want to see what the future of a society looks like, look to what they're teaching their children. And the unfortunate truth, which I then began to study for my thesis and to learn and then become an expert in, is that throughout the Muslim world, not just in the Palestinian Authority-administered territories or the Gaza formerly administered by Hamas, but throughout the Muslim world, children are subject to a steady stream of hate indoctrination coming from their religious leaders, their clerics, their teachers. It's present in their textbooks, in their cartoons, in their television programs, and often by their own parents, where these children are taught to revere to a violent form of Islam, to revere death over life, and to aspire to take their own lives as suicide homicide bombers or as child soldiers or as human shields, because then they will receive a reward in the afterlife. And I wrote my paper on this subject, that the child suicide homicide bomber and that millions of Muslim children throughout the world are being subjected to a human rights abuse that is being ignored. It's being ignored by Human Rights Watch. It's being ignored by child soldier advocacy groups for one reason and one reason only, because it is politicized. Because that hate indoctrination is used as a campaign against Israel, against the Jewish state. And we have to remove the politics from it, and we have to criticize the hate education for what it is, a human rights abuse, and frankly, I believe the root cause of terror. And so after I did my paper on this, I ended up raising about 250,000 Canadian dollars, which was nothing, and decided that I was going to make a documentary film about the subject. I ended up traveling to the Middle East. I traveled to Jenin. I went to Ramallah. I went to Tulkarm. I went to Nablus and other surrounding areas and towns. And I secured first-hand interviews with leaders of designated terrorist groups that recruit children for terror activity. I interviewed leaders of Hamas. I interviewed leaders of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. I interviewed leaders of Islamic Jihad. I went into their schools. I filmed kindergartens run by Islamic Jihad, where in one of our sessions, we had about 25 kindergarten-aged children. And we went around and said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And each child answered under the supervision of their teacher, Shaheed, Shaheed, martyr, martyr. And the one child that answered and said, I want to be a teacher, was immediately reprimanded by his teacher, ironically, and told, no, tell the camera that you want to be a Shaheed. And now, after October the 7th, I don't think there's any single person in this room who's ignorant to the problem of hate education, especially in the Palestinian Muslim context. I mean, just recently we saw with the very gruesome, disgusting display of when the Bibas children and their mother, their coffins were brought to an area that was set up by Hamas and put on stage. Children were present. And after the coffins were removed from the stage, Palestinian children were encouraged to go on the stage and dance and celebrate the murder of other children. This is grotesque and this is abusive. And we need to call it out for what it is. I went into prisons. I interviewed Hussam Abdu himself, and it was quite interesting because when I first interviewed him in 2004, he told me the truth. He told me he was too scared, that he didn't want to blow himself up. He was scared of the consequences. He was scared of death. You know, that wasn't indoctrinated out of him. He was scared that maybe his family would lose their home because of the IDF policy of demolishing the homes of suicide homicide bombers. And by the way, after Hussam had given himself up, the Palestinian terrorist organization started sending children with remote-controlled bombs. And they were blowing them up by remote control so they couldn't turn themselves in as well. And nothing was said by Human Rights Watch. Nothing was said by Amnesty International. Not a peep from Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, who are very good on all the other issues. But when it comes to the abuse, specifically of Palestinian Muslim children, they are silent because that is used as a tool to attack Jews and to attack the Jewish state. They have become politicized and therefore have lost their credibility for their failure to criticize. Now, I ended up I forgot to say, so I interviewed Hussam Abdu in 2004, and he told me, you know, I was too scared. Now, fast forward a year, I came back to the prison. I interviewed him again, and he lied to me. And he said, you know, I pressed it once, twice, 3 times. It didn't work. I really wanted to blow myself up, but it didn't work. And the truth was, 1 year in an Israeli prison, mingling with the terrorists who are in that prison had ruined that boy's future. And yet the Israelis were stuck between a rock and a hard spot because on the one hand, you know, you have this child, he, you know, committed or attempted to commit a crime, right? He was sentenced to prison, he's matriculated through prison, but if they send him back to the society that just tried to kill him, he would no doubt have been eliminated for being a traitor and for aiding and abetting the Zionist entity. So they had no choice. And at that time, when I filmed the movie, there were over 400 Palestinian minors in Israeli prisons who were arrested for attempting to carry out violent activities. And nobody was criticizing it. So I ended up releasing the film, and lo and behold, we got accepted to the United Nations Documentary Film Festival in 2006. And we ended up winning the Audience Choice Award for Best Film, which was shocking to me and ironic. It was shocking because the United Nations is no friend of Israel, as we know, is one of the greatest theaters for anti-Israel and anti-Jewish lawfare, which we'll talk about soon. But UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is the arm of the UN, which was tasked with providing aid and education in Judea, Samaria, or the West Bank, and in Gaza, was itself responsible for the very crime that I was exposing, because UNRWA schools hire off the Hamas payroll. They hire designated terrorist groups to come into the schools, including Al-Qutla al-Islamiyah, which is Hamas's youth wing, which is actively invited into UN schools to recruit children from the classroom for their terror activity. The curriculum that United Nations Relief Works Agency schools use is provided by Hamas or the Palestinian Authority and is one of hate indoctrination of the worst kind. UNRWA schools have been used as weapon depots, are used as rocket launching facilities, and we know that Hamas and other terrorist groups have dug under UNRWA facilities and used them for their bases and headquarters, which facilitates their policy of using children and civilians as human shields. So there I was on stage with Benicio del Toro handing me an award on behalf of the United Nations for a film that I did exposing the very crime that they were complicit in. Now, once we got that laurel, as opposed to going straight and taking the bar exam, I decided that I was going to travel the world for a year and enter the film into various film festivals. And so we did. We went to the Amsterdam Film Festival, we were in the Brooklyn Film Festival, we went to the Alaska Film Festival, And everywhere I went, the film was described as one that was exposing human rights abuses against Palestinian children. And the audience came, they sat through the movie, and were always shocked that it wasn't a movie about the crimes of IDF soldiers. And they came out sort of like stupefied, because they couldn't blame the Jews for what was going on. In fact, there was no justification, right? There's no religious, there's no moral, there's no political justification for infanticide, for the abuse of your own children, no matter how much you hate the Jews. Any thinking person must agree. And what was sparked from this film was an incredible dialogue. And a dialogue between people who would have otherwise disagreed when it comes to, international politics and the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but could agree and form a base consensus on a very simple issue. And that issue is that Muslim children are innocent. Muslim children deserve to live. They deserve equal protection under the law. They don't deserve to be taught to hate and to kill themselves. And from that base consensus, perhaps we can work up. And one of the film screenings that we did was at Cardozo, which is where I graduated from law school. And I invited Alan Dershowitz and Hamid Dabashi, who was the Edward Said's protege at Columbia University and a rabid anti-Semitic, anti-Israel professor. Now, the reason why I invited him is because I wanted to see if we could come to a consensus on this issue. And no matter how much he wanted to fight it, after the screening of the film, I had me, Alan Dershowitz, and this professor at Columbia University coming to an agreement that Muslim children are innocent. Now, from that consensus, we moved up. Well, if Muslim children are innocent, do they deserve to be murdered? No. So then can we condemn the terrorist groups outright, unequivocally, because there's no justification for intentionally murdering children? Can you condemn the terrorist groups that are doing it? And he was forced to condemn it. So, well, if you can condemn the terrorist groups, can you therefore condemn the educational system that's being taught to the children to encourage them and make them like ripe fruit for the picking for these terrorist groups? And he agreed. And so I realized that there was a power here. There was a power in, I wouldn't say dumbing down, but reducing the issue to one of human rights and children's rights, and getting rid of the politicized nature of that issue. But there was only one problem. Every time that I went and spoke publicly about this issue, every time, and I was invited on television because we ended up winning this award. I was invited at 26 years old with no media experience whatsoever by Wolf Blitzer on CNN. He was the first person to put me on television. He featured the film. I was invited then by Sean Hannity, who was the first person to put me on Fox News, who featured me in a segment on the film. I was invited by the White House. I was invited by the State Department. I went to U.S. CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, and I was asked for the over 92 hours of footage that I had collected making this film, and I turned it over to U.S. CENTCOM. Because at that time, we still didn't comprehend the mentality of the suicide homicide bomber. We were asking our question, why do they hate us so much that they're willing to kill themselves? But I told them this is the wrong question. It's not why do they hate us so much. The question is, why are they teaching their children to hate life and to love death? And when we talk about the real issue, which is radicalism and hate indoctrination and extremism, then we can come to some sort of strategy to defeat this threat, which is a shared threat to all Western democracies. And every time I spoke or I went on TV or I wrote an article, I was called Islamophobic. I was accused of being racist. I was accused of being anti-Muslim, which was so curious to me, because if risking my life to make a documentary film to protect the human rights of innocent Muslim children is anti-Muslim, right? What then is pro-Muslim? And isn't that the bigotry of low expectations that people like Bret Stephens talks about all the time? How is it Islamophobic to argue that Muslim children do not deserve to die? And it wasn't just me. anyone who was speaking publicly about the very real and imminent threat that radical Islam posed was not only slandered as racist and Islamophobic, but they were sued to shut them up, or they were targeted with violence. Recall, for example, Theo van Gogh, who made a film with Ayaan Hirsi Ali about the treatment of women under Islam. Theo van Gogh was stabbed in the back in the streets of Amsterdam. His last words were famously, "Can we talk about this?" Recall the firebombing of the offices of Charlie Hebdo after they released a cartoon featuring Muhammad with a bomb in the turban. If we can't satirize this, if we can't talk about it, if we can't write about the threat of radical Islam, then we will never be able to understand it. And we will never be able, therefore, to defeat it. And one of the lowest points was when I think it was the Binghamton police in the UK, it was found, had knowledge for many, many years of a child sex trafficking ring. I think it was a Pakistani child sex trafficking ring, but didn't do anything about it and were too afraid to report to their superiors. Well, innocent little girls were being raped and murdered and trafficked because they didn't want to be accused of being Islamophobic. And this is what I call the Islamophobomania campaign, because it was absolutely insane. And it was designed to silence free speech about issues of national security and public concern. Now, there was the violence, there was the slander, and there were the lawsuits. Anybody who was brave enough to speak publicly about charitable front organizations that were being used by foreign governments to radicalize our population were being sued, right? So one of my first clients was an Iranian American named Hassan Diol Eslam. Now, Hassan came to the United States. He left his family in Iran, thinking that he could come here and take advantage and write and use the First Amendment rights under the Constitution to speak freely and openly about the issue of Iranian influence within the United States. Hassan wrote a blog, and the blog was about NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, the head of which, Trita Parsi, you might have seen on CNN many times advocating for the Iran deal. And Hassan called NIAC the lobbying arm of the Iranian government. NIAC turned around and sued Hassan for defamation. We ended up representing him, raising funds for his lawsuit, and providing him with pro bono legal counsel, because the strategy is that if you're going to be a defendant in a defamation lawsuit, the first thing that your lawyer is going to tell you is button it up, right? So you are going to intimidate someone into silence by filing a frivolous defamation lawsuit against them. Well, we provided Hassan with pro bono legal counsel, and when it came to the discovery process, which means that we were entitled to discover the emails, the financial documents, the text messages or what have you of NIAC to prove what he was saying is true, NIAC destroyed their hard drive. They destroyed their evidence, and they were sanctioned by the court over $135,000 for the unlawful destruction of evidence, and obviously the lawsuit was dropped. 17 media defendants, including my former boss, Daniel Pipes, found themselves on the receiving end of a lawsuit filed by the Islamic Society of Boston. Now, the reason why they were sued, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Daniel Pipes, and I think, it was like over a dozen other newspapers were sued for defamation for reporting on the fact that ISB, as they alleged, was receiving funds from Saudi Arabia going into this mosque to radicalize the local Boston Muslim population. Now, all of these media defendants were sued. They stopped reporting about it. The FBI did not investigate. And lo and behold, not too soon after, we had the Boston bombing attack, where two young Muslim men who were allegedly radicalized and attended the ISB carried out a deadly bombing attack. And you wonder, if these people were able to continue to write and speak freely about these issues, perhaps that attack never would have happened. And what I realized was going on was a coordinated legal campaign, which I called a lawfare campaign. Lawfare being a term of art, the use of the law as a weapon of war. Because our enemies know that they cannot defeat us on the battlefield. So they create the asymmetric battlefield, as we see in Gaza, where civilians are used as human shields, so they can have a lawfare campaign accusing Israel of human rights violations. They create a legal battlefield. They file war crimes charges against Israeli officials, and they file war crimes charges against American officials, and they attempt to constrain our ability to operate on the battlefield using legal means. And that was what was going on. So I ended up writing my first book called Lawfare, The War Against Free Speech, about the myriad of lawsuits that were happening all around the world in an attempt to silence counterterrorism professionals and members of the media. One of my clients was a counterterrorism expert in Canada who was asked during Canadian hearings and subsequent terror financing trials to testify as an expert. The very charitable organizations that he was testifying against turned around and sued him for defamation. Obviously, they lost, because the aim is not to win. He had a privilege as an expert witness, under oath to testify. But again, the tactic was to silence and to intimidate. So I ended up writing my book about this. And what I realized is not only was an attack on free speech in our country, but as I said before, there was a greater, very well-funded lawfare attack against Western democracies, specifically against Israel, with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the ICJ advisory opinion, the war crimes charges against Israeli officials. So Ariel Sharon and back then, and now Bibi Netanyahu can't even land in a friendly democratic country without fear of an arrest warrant, while Hamas and Hezbollah are crossing European borders with impunity, right? That's not justice. That's lawfare. The International Court of Justice's advisory opinion that declared Israel's security barrier, brick, mortar, and barbed wire, a violation of international law. Those very same court refused to enter into evidence the very relevant fact that the fence contributed, and still does contribute, to a sharp decline in the loss of human lives from acts of terror. That court refused to enter into evidence testimony of Jewish, Muslim, Bedouin, Christian terror victims. That is not justice, that is lawfare. And the more I studied and wrote about this subject, the more I realized how well-funded and organized this lawfare campaign was. There were a myriad of legal funds with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars set up with a specific purpose and goal of abusing our legal system to file frivolous charges against anyone who was raising awareness about the threat of radical Islam as a national security issue. And they were very well funded. You have the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a Muslim Brotherhood front group and an unindicted conspirator in a terror financing trial, has a litigation fund. The Muslim Legal Fund for America, right? There's so many legal funds out there. There's even legal funds that are designed to pursue interests of other groups like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Center for Constitutional Rights and so forth. And after 2.5 years of representing clients on the defense, after I made the movie, I forgot this part, I ended up working for Daniel Pipes, who was one of the lawfare defendants in the ISB lawsuit. And we set up a litigation defense fund where we provided financial support and pro bono counsel for anyone moderate Muslim, pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, counterterrorism who was subjected to one of these frivolous lawsuits. And I did that for about 2.5 years, and that's what I wrote my book on. But after doing this for 2.5 years, it occurred to me, why are we on the defense, right? How is it that the Jewish community, who is the greatest victim, and we are being victimized, and it's okay to accept that, and to accept that we've been victimized. We have a pushback against that. But why is it that we haven't organized for ourselves a strategic legal offense to enforce our civil rights, right? The truth is on our side. The law is on our side. Our students' rights are being violated across the campus. Israeli businesses are being discriminated against. Jewish doctors are being discriminated against. Why haven't we used the law to our advantage? Why are we always on the defense? So I ended up forming the project in 2010, which was, at that time, the only Jewish civil rights litigation fund in existence that was organized to strategically use the legal system to enforce our civil rights. And what was incredible to me was the pushback that I got from the Jewish community. And I want to step back by explaining exactly what impact litigation is, right? And I said this earlier at the pre-glow. Civil rights litigation is as American as apple pie, right? If you think about it, every single civil right, human right that we enjoy in this country is a product of a seminal civil rights case, right? Whether it's Roe v. Wade, which was recently partially overturned, which guaranteed the women's right to an abortion, and now it's become a state issue. That was a Supreme Court case. Brown v. Board of Education, which ended anti-Black segregation in our country. That was a Supreme Court case. The recent Asian American case against Harvard University ended affirmative action. Now, I challenge anyone in this room to name me one seminal Supreme Court Jewish civil rights case. And there was none. And this was remarkable to me because there are so many lawyers in our community. There's a ton of philanthropy in our community. Why is it that we have not stood up for ourselves in courts of law? Because if we don't enforce our own civil rights, nobody is going to do it for us. And yet, in 2010, when I established the Lawfare Project and we filed our first case, I got pushback from the Jewish community. One gentleman in particular who headed up a now defunct major Jewish organization, more left-leaning organization, self-described left-leaning, although I don't even know what that means anymore, called me up and was yelling and screaming at me. Who do I think I am? You are too aggressive. We're negotiating behind closed doors and you're messing up those negotiations. Never mind the students on behalf of which we filed the lawsuit that he was negotiating for were the ones who came to us and asked for our help. You're causing anti-Semitism. You're feeding into the narrative that we're moneyed up and we're going to use the courts to silence Palestinian free speech. And I thought to myself, could you ever imagine a situation where someone in the Black community accuses the NAACP of too aggressively asserting Black civil rights? What is it? Why are we so against standing up for ourselves? What was going on here? And the fact that we hadn't filed these lawsuits, that we haven't imposed consequences for the perpetrators of anti-Jewish discrimination has created an environment where that discrimination has flourished because the perpetrators have not gotten any consequences to their discriminatory behavior. So in 2010, I formed the Lawfare Project, And we started filing legal cases on behalf of Jewish communities around the world. And I want to tell you about some of those cases, because although each of them is unique, it's all the same fact pattern. The defendant is treated differently because he or she is Jewish or Israeli. That's it. It's that simple. And what I learned through impact litigation was something very important. I'm going to touch that a little bit later. I'm going to tell you first the story, and through the stories, we're going to learn the lesson. So one of the first entities that we sued was Kuwait Airways Corporation. Now, Kuwait Airways Corporation is the airline of the government of Kuwait. The government of Kuwait is part of the Arab League boycott, which was the original boycott from which the modern-day BDS movement stems. And the goal of the Arab League boycott, which is still very much alive and well today, is to engage in economic warfare against Israel, to strangle Israel economically, to destroy it and to pressure it into, suicide and self-defeat. And Kuwait Airways refused to carry Israeli passengers. So we sent, or passengers with an Israeli passport. We sent our client to JFK Airport and filmed our client, an Israeli, attempting to buy a ticket on Kuwait Airways to go to London. And he was refused. We turned around and we sued Kuwait Airways. We sued them in multiple jurisdictions. We filed actions against them in the United States. We filed actions against them in Europe. And before we were even able to step foot in a court of law, Kuwait Airways shut down over half of all of its flight paths, including its flight from New York to London and all of its inter-European flights, because they would rather lose millions of dollars than fly an Israeli. And that action cost us about $5,000. For $5,000 and time of our in-house counsel, we were able to shut down over half of all Kuwait Airways flight paths because of their anti-Israel discrimination. The National Lawyers Guild is the oldest lawyers guild in America. It has dozens of chapters, hundreds of members, and they passed a BDS resolution. Now, our client was a company called Bibliotechnical, which was incorporated in Judea. Every year, the National Lawyers Guild has a gala, and our client decided to purchase a half-page ad for about $200 in their, annual gala dinner journal that said something like, "Congratulations, National Lawyers Guild, love Bibliotechnical, Judea, Israel." Well, very shortly after he purchased that half-page ad, the National Lawyers Guild was stupid enough to send an email to my client saying, "I'm sorry, we have to return your money. We don't do business with Israelis." Well, we turned around and we sued the National Lawyers Guild for anti-Jewish discrimination. And before we were even able to step into court, the National Lawyers Guild came to us and said, okay, we want to settle the case. And sometimes, by the way, you can achieve more through a settlement agreement than you can through winning a case. So in the settlement agreement, we forced the National Lawyers Guild board to pass another resolution, nullifying their previous resolution and stating that the National Lawyers Guild does not endorse national origin discrimination. We forced them to send letters to every single chapter saying that if you engage in BDS, you will lose the ability to use the National Lawyers Guild chapter logo. You cannot be part of the Lawyers Guild. And this was the best part, we forced them to do business with our client. We took out an ad, this time a full-page ad, in the following year, and the Guild was so kind, they said, no, we're gonna give you the ad page for free. We said, no, we're gonna pay for it. And we paid for that, and we forced them to do business. Because the BDS movement, and we often use these acronyms, and we use them to our disadvantage, because if you were to go, to, I don't know, New York City downtown and poll 100 people, not Jewish, and ask them, what is BDS? I guarantee you, 9 out of 10 wouldn't know what that acronym is. What BDS is and how we should describe it is anti-Jewish discrimination, illegal discrimination. And almost every state in this country has anti-discrimination laws. And those laws clearly state that you cannot engage in discrimination against someone based on their race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, and so forth. In a business context, you cannot have a restaurant that says no blacks allowed, right? You cannot have a club and say no Chinese people are allowed to be members of this club. So too can you not run a business and say we don't do business with Israelis. That is illegal. So we were able to use the anti-discrimination law, and we defeated BDS in New York State with this one case. The next case that we filed, was against San Francisco State University, or SFSU. Now, SFSU, at that time, was ground zero for the anti-Israel student campus movement. In the 1970s, Yasser Arafat himself flew from Egypt. And by the way, Yasser Arafat was not Palestinian. Okay? There's no state called Palestine. Yasser Arafat was an Egyptian. He flew from Egypt to San Francisco State University in the 70s, and he established GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, which then became SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. SFSU is where the Israeli apartheid campus movement started. It's where the on-campus BDS resolution started. It was really the lion's den, the testing ground for anti-Jewish, anti-Israel student advocacy. Now, fast forward. We represented students who were members of Hillel, which was the only Jewish student group on campus at that time. Now, Hillel was the only group that was denied the ability to table at the student fair. And the reason that the school gave was because this is a Zionist-free zone. And when Hillel at that time said, well, wait a minute, we're the type of good Jews. We're against Netanyahu. We're against the illegal Israeli occupation. They said, I don't care. You're a Jew, you're a Zionist group, and you are not allowed to table here. Okay, so they didn't discriminate based on how left-wing or right-wing the Jewish student groups is, the same way Hamas didn't discriminate in terms of who they were killing, etc. Our enemies don't discriminate against us based on what our political positions are. I just wish we didn't discriminate against each other based on our political positions, but we'll get into that later too. Now, also what happened at that school is that the Hillel student group invited the then mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat, to speak. Now, the event became so dangerous for the Jewish students when a Palestinian or pro-Palestinian or pro-terror mob came to the event and shouted down the former Jerusalem mayor and threatened the students with violence to the point that the police had to escort them out. The Jewish students were escorted off campus under police protection because they were being threatened by this violent mob. And this is way before October the 7th. And we sued the school. We sued the school for Title VI violations, for discriminating against the Jewish students and so forth. And what was remarkable to me is that when we sued the school specifically, based on the fact pattern of denying Hillel, the only Jewish group on campus, a table at a student fair so they could advertise, their student group to the incoming freshmen, the school did not deny that they did that. It was not a fact at issue that we were litigating. The school said, yes, You're right, we did not allow Hillel to table. But again, it's not a violation of California anti-discrimination law. We didn't discriminate against them because they're Jewish. We discriminated against them because they're Zionists. And Zionism is a political point of view. And the California state law prohibits discrimination based on certain categories, as I mentioned before, race, ethnicity, your gender, so on and so forth. Political points of view are not a protected category under the California Anti-Discrimination Act. Therefore, what we did was perfectly legal. And we replied, well, number one, who are you to define what Zionism is for our clients, right? Zionism is their religious, ethnic, national identity. It's integral to their Jewish identity and who they are. And I know I don't have to explain why to this audience, but even if you're right, even if it's just a political point of view, only the Jewish students are given a political litmus test as a precondition to participate in state-funded activities, and therefore it's de facto discrimination. You don't go to the Chinese Student Association and say, well, what's your position on China's handling of COVID? And unless you come up with the right answer, you can't table here. You don't go to the Muslim Student Association and say, well, what's your position on Iranian nuclear disarmament? And only if you're a good Muslim who agrees with us and has the right politics, we're going to let you table here. Only the Jewish students are given a political litmus test in order to participate, and that is discrimination on its face. Day one, we show up in court. San Francisco State University settled the case with us. We rewrote their anti-discrimination policy, which now reads that SFSU recognizes that Zionism is an integral part of the Jewish identity. So therefore, anti-Zionist discrimination is a civil rights issue. It's not a political issue. And this is such an important takeaway that I wanted to mention before, right? Because when I go into court, I don't, when we sue the National Lawyers Guild and they say, well, BDS Israel as their, affirmative defense of discrimination, I don't have to go to the judge and make an argument why BDS is wrong. I don't have to say, judge, well, Israel is not an apartheid state, we have Arab MKs, we have a gay pride parade, so on and so forth. That's irrelevant. I don't care what your motive is for discrimination. It's irrelevant. All I have to show is that my client was treated differently because he or she or it is Jewish or Israeli. And that is open and shut discrimination. The more that we respond, and we're going to get into this a little bit later too, to anti-Jewish discrimination with pro-Israel advocacy, the more we give them an affirmative defense to discriminate against us. I want to mention a couple other lawsuits so you understand the power of impact litigation. When Saudi Arabia was picked to host the annual World Chess Tournament, they also refused to allow Israelis entry. We sent a very strongly worded letter to the International Chess Federation telling them that if they do this, they will be in violation of several laws as well as their own governing documents, and they canceled the chess tournament in Saudi Arabia. When we heard, they moved it out of Saudi Arabia. When we heard that that Hamas was going to host their annual gathering and conference of terrorist leaders at the Intercontinental Hotel in Doha, we sent a similar letter to the Intercontinental Hotel Group, which is an American company, warning them that if they host a specially designated foreign terrorist group, that they could potentially face up to 21 years in prison and a host of other lawsuits based on material support for terrorism. Within 2 or 3 days of sending that letter, the Intercontinental Hotel canceled Hamas's meeting in Doha at their facilities. Currently, we are suing Carnegie Mellon University. Now, what's so important about this case is that Carnegie Mellon University happens to be the 3rd largest recipient of funding from Qatar, Qatar being the 2nd largest state sponsor of Islamist terrorism and Hamas. And we're all asking ourselves, why is this radicalization in the education system happening in this country? Well, we represent students at Carnegie Mellon University, a student at Carnegie Mellon University, who is discriminated against, who is subject to a hostile environment based on the fact that she's Jewish. And through this lawsuit, we are going to be able to discover the connections between foreign funding from groups like Qatar Foundation International and the radicalization happening on our campuses. We currently represent a student from Columbia University. We're suing the university. This is a student who was subjected to a hostile mob threatening her with violence. The university refused to accommodate her, refused to allow her to take classes on Zoom, retaliated against her after reporting anti-Semitic activity, and we are suing the school, and we will achieve justice for her as well. We currently represent over 70 of the Israeli victims of the Amsterdam pogrom, where we are now filing legal actions. We have assisted and we have attached our claims to the criminal actions that are happening in Amsterdam right now, and we are about to file civil lawsuits against all of the parties that were involved in facilitating and allowing this pogrom to happen. We represent the 2 students at DePaul University who were beaten. One of them was beaten into a concussion after the university canceled the security that they had on place, even though they knew that it was a hostile environment and a dangerous environment for Jewish students. We represent 10 out of the 11 students who were locked in the library at Cooper Union as pro-Hamas mobs were banging on the glass window. I'm sure you saw it in social media. And what's interesting about this case is how eerily similar it was to San Francisco State, because I forgot to mention that when the police, the campus police at SFSU, asked the administration if they were to remove the protesters from the harassment of the Jewish students at the event with Mayor Nir Barkat, the administration gave them a stand-down order. They said, no, don't do anything. They basically wanted to see what would happen. The same thing happened at Cooper Union. While the students were being locked in the library, while the pro-Hamas mob was chanting and banging on the walls, the campus police requested to remove the unlawful trespassers. And what did the administration did? Gave them a stand-down order. And this time the president locked herself in her office to protect herself and then escaped out of the back route of the school to leave the Jewish students there, potentially to be assaulted and to be harmed. So we are engaged in incredibly important civil rights litigation, and we are going to win, and we are going to create the systemic change that we need to see on our campuses. Now, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but there's one more thing that I want to mention. I think it's extraordinarily important, and that has to do with the founding of the End Jew Hatred movement. So about 3.5, 4 years ago, we were in the middle of COVID. I had actually just given birth to my 3rd child, and I was living in Brooklyn. And at that time, Black Lives Matter was looting and rioting in my neighborhood. They had lit a cop car on fire a block and a half away from me. I lived close to Barclays Stadium. And the fraud was coming out, and so on and so forth. And I was noticing, basically, that a lot of my friends were still hashtagging Black Lives Matter, were hashtagging the same way that they were hashtagging Me Too and marching in the movement, because they believed in the issues of Black civil rights. They believed, as I do, in the issue of women's rights. But there was sort of a cognitive dissonance that had to take place, because on one hand, while you supported the civil rights issues, the actual Black Lives Matter movement, which after October the 7th also put as an image, I think it was the Chicago chapter, of a paraglider, of a Hamas paraglider, there was a cognitive dissonance that you had to, hold in order to support both. The same thing with the Me Too movement. You wanted to support, women's rights, but you're marching as a Jew behind Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory, who are extraordinarily anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And, I wanted to understand, why is it that in the age of minority rights movements, with all of the hashtags and all, the support for every single minority out there, for women's rights, for gays' rights, for Muslims' rights, for Black rights, how is it that the Jewish community, the oldest, most persecuted minority community in human history, still has not achieved parity? Why am I not able? It's not socially acceptable to say the N-word, but it's perfectly acceptable to engage in Jew hatred at a cocktail party, or to say things that are anti-Semitic with no consequence. So as a maternity leave project, I decided that I wanted to do a study into the basic question of, why does Israel have such bad PR, right? And we funded a study, and it took about 2.5 months. We hired a political advocacy group, and we did a deep dive into almost every single minority rights, civil rights movement in America. We studied the Black civil rights movements of the 50s and the 60s. We studied the old women's rights movement, the End Asian Hate movement, the pro-Palestinian movement, the Soviet Jewry movement. And we wanted to understand, what are the strategies, the tactics, the messaging, how are they organized? And if we replace Black or Muslim or gay with Jew, can we use the same strategies and tactics to our advantage, right? And the first thing that we learned from this study, and I'm going to conclude with the 5 points that we learned from this study. And if there's anything that you take away from this lecture today, let it be this. The first thing that we learned from the study was that we were asking the wrong question, right? We were asking the question, why does Israel have such bad PR? That was the wrong question. The right question was, why has there never been a Jewish civil rights movement in America? There's never been a Jewish civil rights movement in America. Jews have always marched and advocated for the rights of other. We were instrumental. Rabbi Heschel marching with Martin Luther King. We were instrumental in the civil rights movement. We were instrumental in the women's movement. We even had 2 Jews who founded the Me Too movement that were kicked out by Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory. But how come Jews are marching for Black rights, Jews are marching for gay rights? How about Jews marching for Jewish rights? Why has that never happened? And so we launched, based on this study, the first ever Jewish civil rights movement in American history, and that is the End Jew Hatred movement. And so we launched it based on the next 4 points that we learned from this study, which are the takeaways that I want you to have today. What makes for a successful civil rights movement in the 21st century? The first thing that we learned is every successful civil rights movement has a good name. Everything is in the name, right? So Black Lives Matter. If you're against Black Lives Mattering, you are a racist. Forget the fraud or the looting and all the controversy. You have to stand for Black Lives Mattering. If you don't, you are a bigot. If you are against women's rights, you are a misogynist. The way that we describe ourselves is pro-Israel, right? And what that does is it immediately sets up a binary, right? If I'm pro-Israel, I recognize there's also anti-Israel, or there's pro-Palestinian. If I'm an objective person, I need to I need to hear both sides, and maybe I'll come up somewhere in the middle. You have your truth, he has his truth, and I'm gonna come, somewhere in the middle. The other thing, and by the way, we also learned about the origin of the term anti-Semitism. Now, I didn't know this before the study, The term anti-Semitism was invented by German eugenicists, and it was not a negative term. It was a pseudo-intellectual way of them describing why all of the Semitic races, not just Jews, but all of the Semitic races were inferior to the white Caucasian race. And then we went and we adopted this terminology the same way that we adopt a lot of the terminology of our enemy, and we've used it going forward. And actually, Ronald Lauder, who is one of the founding supporters of Lawfare Project and a big supporter of the End Jew Hatred movement, told me that when he goes to a cocktail party and he says, well, that's anti-Semitic, it doesn't faze anyone. But when he says, you're a Jew hater, everyone's, oh, no, I don't hate Jews. I'm not a Jew hater. Because if you're against hatred against blacks, or hatred against Muslims, or hatred against gays, so too must you be against hatred against Jews, or you are the bigot. Everything is in the name, and that's why we called it the End Jew Hatred movement. Now, and by the way, it's not a 501c3. If you are against ending Jew hatred, you are part of the movement. It is a movement in the truest sense. The second thing we learned, and there's 4 things, and then I'll conclude, is that civil rights movements speak the language of civil rights, right? They talk about occupation and genocide and apartheid and so on and so forth. We're speaking the language of foreign policy, national security, UN Resolution 242, right? If you want to be a Jewish advocate, we're telling our students you have to be pro-Israel, you have to go into the arena with a shield, not a sword. You have to memorize a 15-page pamphlet on, why Israel is an apartheid state. You have to get a friggin' law degree to make all of these legal arguments, and you're on the defense and you're gonna lose, right? If we speak the language of civil rights, if we respond to anti-Jewish discrimination as a civil rights issue, then we can make progress. Because the more we respond to anti-Jewish discrimination with pro-Israel advocacy, the more you give them an affirmative defense to discriminate against you. The 4th thing we learned is that successful civil rights movements are grassroots, right? We have organized ourselves, and this is not a criticism of our storied, amazing Jewish organizations, of which I support and I love and I work with. But to date, we have organized ourselves very, top-heavy. We are told that if we want to fight anti-Semitism, if we want to fight against Jew hatred, we have to write a check to, fill in the blank organization, and they will take care of it for us. But that's not how we're going to solve the problem. Civil rights movements go into communities. They train everyone to adopt philosophies and to activate themselves to the best of their abilities for a cause. They are localized, right? Well, there's not much that maybe anyone in this room can do about AOC or Rashida Tlaib. There's surely something we can do if there's, a local bar or restaurant that puts up a sign that says no Zionists allowed. I'm sure we can mobilize 400 people to go protest outside and shut that bar down. Civil rights movements that are successful go into communities, train new leaders, are grassroots, and mobilize communities to activate for themselves, right? The students often come to me and, they say, how do I defeat the BDS resolution? What should I do about all the anti-Israel advocacy? And I always tell the students, it's not your job to advocate for a foreign country. It's your job to advocate for yourself as a minority, to receive equal protection. And so you have to speak the language of civil rights, and we have to mobilize every single person to activate themselves, to go after local issues. And the 4th thing and the conclusion is successful civil rights movements in the 21st century impose consequences for the behavior they don't want to see. And when I read that part of the study, I realized why it was me that ended up, funding it. Because that's exactly what we do every day in courts of law, right? We impose consequences for behavior we don't want to see. You create a precedent, even though I have a specific fact pattern or I have my plaintiff and we're going after one defendant. You're creating a precedent in a court of law or with your settlement agreement, which will apply to everybody else engaging in that behavior, and you deter that similar behavior because they don't want to have the same consequences. Now, I'm in the pro-Israel advocacy space, right? I can't even remember who the anti-Semite of the week was 2 weeks ago, right? Because we are existing in what we call a target-rich environment. So while yesterday it's Adidas or Kanye, and today it's Roger Waters, and tomorrow it's some BDS on some campus, we have not focused in on our target, our Harvey Weinstein, for example, or focused in on our George Floyd victim and created campaigns that impose consequences for the behavior we don't want to see, right? The Me Too movement did not end male misogyny, but they created a precedent. They picked one target, they took that target down, and now nobody wants to be like Harvey Weinstein, right? The Black civil rights movement did not end anti-Black racism, but they created consequences for behavior and shaped a society so that somebody will be shunned for the behavior that they don't want to see. We have failed as a Jewish community to create any consequences for the behavior we don't want to see. Now, I fear that I have gone way over my time allotted to me today because I have so much to say. There are so many examples, and I think we'll get into it in the conversation if you'll still have me here, of successes where we have empowered local activists. We have provided them with funding, with pro bono legal support for them to mobilize in a grassroots fashion to solve their own problems with the strategies and the language and organization that we guide them on. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their time and for their patience. And we'll continue the conversation.
Brooke, wow, look at this. This is wonderful. Thank you so very much. We could listen to her all night, couldn't we? And she would let us. Come sit down, Brooke. Thank you so much. You've really given us so much to think about and really put it in a context that really makes so much sense. And I think that the whole concept of lawfare is new to me and a very unique and powerful way to address anti-Semitism. And in Israel and throughout the world. We are welcoming tonight Jordan Acker, who is a regent for the University of Michigan. You are well known and loved. I love that he's the first regent to have graduated in the 21st century. How fun is that? We're welcoming Jordan tonight because, as many of you know, if you're following the news, Jordan has been the target of virulent anti-Semitism over the last year here in our community. And we wanted you to be able to share your story and engage in a little discussion about anti-Semitism locally and also what we can do. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I have to just say, I saw Rabbi Loss somewhere in the crowd tonight. So if he married my parents 45 years ago, so if you don't like anything that I said, it's literally his fault. But I'll share my story real quick and what has happened. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on at the University of Michigan. So the university, our board of regents is an 8-person elected board, 6 Democrats, 2 Republicans, but we're united on a lot of things. One of the things we are united on is opposing BDS. And it's been a consistent for 25 years. And you could snap to that, thank you. And we had, oh, hi, Rabbi Loss, it's good to see you. We put out a statement just after October 7th that reiterated that statement. It was from 2 of my colleagues who are not Jewish. But the harassment did not go to them. It came to me. First, in the summer of 2024, our law office in Southfield was vandalized with anti-Semitic messages, various curse words directed at me. They did about $100,000 worth of damage to our building. And what was amazing about this was, not amazing, that's not the right word, but astounding, was that 3 student groups decided to post photographs of the vandalism being done in the middle of the night. The chapter of the Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, and the Graduate Employees Organization. All 3 posted them, took them down when they realized they were posting evidence of a crime, but the activity didn't stop. And as my non-Jewish colleagues did not face continued harassment, they came to my house last December. In the middle of the night, about 2 a.m., I hear a shattering of glass, and the police in Huntington Woods, where I live, came there about 90 seconds later to find 2 glass jars of urine thrown through our front window below where my daughter, my 9-year-old, sleeps, and my wife's car painted with upside-down triangles. Now, everyone in this room knows what those upside-down triangles are about and what those mean, and what those mean to Jewish people. So when the media would call me, I'd say, this is a threat. This is a direct threat. And what makes me so sad about it, and I feel this way today, even though it's been a few months now, is that our faculty senate did not feel the need to condemn this behavior until they were called out directly for it. And I'm glad Brooke brought off this comment about San Francisco State University, because this is exactly part of what's going on here. So we had a professor on our campus named Mark Dolinger, who's at San Francisco State, Jewish professor, teaches about the civil rights movement. And about a week before what had happened to me had occurred, Professor Dolinger was trying to give a lecture when he was interrupted probably by the same groups of students. And they said, we don't engage with Zionists here. We don't engage with Zionists here. Now, I'd say, this is a university, we engage with everyone here. But the fact that they went after him, even though it had nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with anything, he was talking about the Jewish community and the Black community. And these 2 incidents happened about a week apart. And again, our faculty, the ones who are supposed to be the grown-ups in the room, refused to condemn it until called out for it. So I'm gonna leave that, I'm gonna continue the conversation, but I will end this with 3 things, and this is something that's difficult as a Jewish elected official, as someone who's a Democrat, and if someone cares about our universities. We have to hold 3 things in the same place. First of all, that our universities do need reform on this, especially at the faculty level. And that, yes, Jewish students have not been treated fairly in our universities over the last 18 months. There is no question about it. The University of Michigan has done a lot better over the past year. It is thankfully not Columbia, but there was definitely a way that we could do better. And the third thing, and this is the important thing, and this is the thing that might be a little controversial tonight, but you all need to hear this. There is no greater force for upward mobility for Jewish Americans in the United States than the universities. So while we need to reform them, we need to make sure not to destroy them, because those are epicenters for jobs, they're epicenters for our own upward mobility, and they're epicenters for all of us who see a U of M doctor or get groundbreaking research that leads to cancer cures. These are the things that we do also. So we have to make sure to do all of those things. So thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back in Temple, Israel, and look forward to talking to you.
Well, let me ask you, thank you, Jordan. Thank you. We're so sorry that you have gone through so much trauma and your family, and I know that you're getting security and you shouldn't have to live under that, and we want to do whatever we can to make our community and your home safe and your family safe. I think this first question kind of goes to the both of you, and let's see what you come up with is, what legal or policy changes do you believe could make the biggest impact in fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses and in the media? So, Brooke, do you want to start with that?
Sure, I'll be brief. I don't think we need to make any changes. I just think we have to enforce the law. And I'd actually be interested in, my question to you is, what happened to the perps? Like, were there any arrests made? Were there any convictions? One point I want to make, though, before you answer that, is the changes that we need to make is we have to unify. And I've talked about this. I don't care what your politics are. I don't care who you voted for. I don't care what your religious affiliation is. But we all have to come to a base consensus that we have to end Jew hatred in our lifetime, what that means, and what are the strategies and tactics that we're using. Now, what disappoints me is that when laws are enforced to our advantage, the political partisan divide that plagues our community has prevented us from effectively using the law. So one perfect example was when President Trump issued an executive order to expand Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to apply to religion and therefore Jewish students. Now, if Obama had done that, or if Bush had done that, I would support it. But it just so happened that it was President Trump. And we were the first organization to file a Title VI complaint on behalf of a Jewish student. Ironically, it was at Columbia University. And the people who pushed back against me was the Jewish community, because they were pissed off that it was Trump that did it. So I don't, this, and I'm not making any political statements. I'm just saying that if a law, an elected official, is expanding civil rights protections for Jews, put your partisan politics aside and support the application of the Civil Rights Act.
I totally agree with you, actually, on that. And I think that's absolutely right. And, one of the things that I would say that, look, I'm going to say something not nice about Joe Biden and positive about Trump. I think that's right. I think that is one of the things that the Biden administration got very, very wrong, was to not start enforcing Title VI earlier. I think that was a disaster for Jewish students who had those rights. And to your point, people from other universities say, how did you get things under control? It's actually not that complicated. You have rules, you enforce your rules, you have laws, you enforce your laws, right? That's what it comes down to. You enforce time, place, manner restrictions, you do all of those things, and you enforce them upon everybody. And, people on the left were pretty upset with Dana Nessel for prosecuting the people who invaded one of our campus buildings. We actually did have a campus building invasion, kind of like Columbia. The Attorney General stepped up and prosecuted those people. And guess what? The intimidation stopped. The violence stopped, because there were rules that she was enforcing. So you're right, to your point, whether it's President Trump or Dana Nessel, you have to enforce those rules. Now I'm going to say something not nice about President Trump. You ready for this? President Trump, that's easier for me. President Trump also cut DOE enforcement staff in half last week. And that's a problem as well. And, these caseworkers were already overloaded with 50 to 60 universities per caseworker, per attorney in the Department of Education. Now they have double that. So I don't know how you enforce Title VI without having these people in the Department of Education, which, by the way, the Department of Education is a civil rights organization and should have been fully funded by Biden and should have been fully funded by Trump as well. So the last thing I'll say, so what happened to the perpetrators who did this? So SJP has been banned from our campus for 2 years. The first part. The Attorney General has an 18-person investigative team working on this, almost like a murder investigation. And I'm hoping, as long as the investigation is open, I can't talk much more about it, but she's working very, very hard on this investigation, and her team with the state police, with local law enforcement, they've done a phenomenal job. But the one thing that I'll say is, what else we can do on campus? Michigan has gotten had a big article in the New York Times about DEI, the $250 million over half decade. What I would say is that whatever you think about DEI and whatever this looks like going forward, and I think it's going to look a lot different than it did over the past few years, but whatever kind of curriculum you have to integrate anti-Semitism as part of that curriculum. And we did that. We took $4 million of that DEI funding and started the Wallenbrook Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And the faculty were upset. They said we stripped money from DEI by including Jews. But that's what we're required to do as a board. We're required to take care of the university for the people of Michigan, not for the faculty, not for the students, not for anyone else. It serves the people ultimately. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
I'll just make one comment, and again, it's not political. So there's several ways of enforcing Title VI, and we're actually lucky that there's also a private right of action. So on the one hand, the way that the government enforces Title VI, if there is a DOE investigation, the ultimate result is the withholding of federal funding. And what Trump did without the DOE is withheld federal funding. Most famously, right now, $400 million from Columbia University. The second thing is that you can file an action. You can file a civil rights lawsuit, and you can allege a violation of Title VI. I think one of the most important things that I would like to revisit, I don't know, you have a comment on it, is the role that foreign funding is playing in the curriculum that we're seeing. Qatar and ISCAP, which is run by Charles Small, who was kicked out of Yale for his educational institution that focused on anti-Semitism, formed ISCAP, and they have recently released a report that shows that Qatar has spent, for at least the past, I think, 10 or 12 years, $1 billion a year, $1 billion a year, funding K through 12, as well as higher education. And I mentioned earlier, Carnegie Mellon University itself, who we're suing, is the recipient of over $800 million from Qatar. Now, what is Qatar doing funding our kindergarten education? And why is it that every school that receives foreign funding has over 300% increase in Jew hatred and anti-Semitic activity? And that is something that, frankly, as a private citizen, we're limited, and that the government needs to take on and investigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that, to your point, I think you're right. I said, and quite frankly, got attacked by The Guardian for saying that I felt like the protest movement was foreign funded. I think there is zero question at this point that there was two types of foreign funding in that particular movement. The first one was directly to engage in certain activities. You would see activities happen at Columbia or Berkeley, and they would quickly be replicated at Michigan. That was the first part. The second part was on social media. Mm-hmm. And I can see this because in my law practice, we micro-target certain areas. They were doing the same thing for our campuses. Students who were in dorms were being bombarded on TikTok and Instagram, especially those two, Snapchat, with images of the war in Gaza, and most of these students don't know any better. They don't have any personal involvement. They don't have a stake in this. All they would see is a war and kids dying, and it's terrible. There's no question about it. But they would get this absurdly one-sided view that didn't make any sense in terms of what you would see if you were actually involved. And I'll give you this point. It gets to your exact point. So after all of this had happened to me, I took a group of trustees to Israel in January, and we went and met with students. We actually invited 3 Palestinian universities to meet with us. They chose not to. We met with 3 Israeli universities, and people don't know this, but about between 20 and 30% of Israeli universities are actually Palestinian students. And we thought about we saw the way that students who had served 200 days in Gaza, or who had families who were entirely wiped out on the other side of the conflict, were able to talk to each other and have conversations about what's a really complicated and difficult problem to solve. And then we were sitting there at Hebrew University, and their vice president for equity inclusion is a Palestinian Arab woman in a mostly Jewish school, says the only place that I was protested in this entire war was at UCLA. And I got there feeling how embarrassing for our students that they were essentially taken in this way, that it was a moment of, when I came home, I just felt, like I wanted to go talk to the students and say, where did you learn all this stuff from? And what you hear over and over and over again was a bombardment on social media of anti-Israel videos. And it went on for probably the first year to year and a half of the war. Mostly, obviously, frankly, probably funded by Iran.
Yeah, how is it that literally on October the 7th and October the 8th, these student groups had all of the same green tents, all of the same materials, had already printed flyers? Like, I know it takes at least 24 hours to put my order into FedEx and print the flyers.
Brooke, I was in London, and before the bodies had even been recovered, there were protesters in the streets at 3 p.m. I mean, the literal attack on the kibbutzim was still going on. They had not, I mean, that's what you're talking about here.
Well, I don't know if anyone read, I think it was the New York Post article that came out yesterday about the 2 janitors who are now suing Colombia. One is a black man and one is Latino. And one of the quotes really stuck out to me. The black guy said, what I thought, and I'm paraphrasing, what I thought was chaos, I soon quickly realized was a highly coordinated, organized campaign where there were masked men, and it was one woman, barking orders at the mob who were all dressed the same, who had gloves so that it protected, that they weren't gonna leave fingerprints. They had zip ties, they knew where to zip tie, they knew how to zip tie, they knew they were moving, what are they called, the drink dispenser machines. They knew what they're doing. These are pro-terror mobs that are being organized and trained. And really the onus is on the government to investigate what the hell is going on here. This is probably one of the greatest subversive campaigns the Western world has ever seen to destroy and undermine our country.
And you know what, to your point, this is how I know it's anti-Semitism and not, anti-Israel bias or whatever it is because you know what group in America is most sympathetic by polling to the Palestinian cause? Do you know what it is? It's American Jews. And instead of creating a movement that included American Jews, because there are a lot, including probably a lot of people sitting in this crowd tonight who would sit there and say, if there was a 2-state solution movement, I would join that. If there was a bring the hostages home and end the war movement, I'd join that too. There was an opportunity that was hijacked, that was directly hijacked. And, I just look back on this last 18 months, it's changed all of us. It certainly has changed me, and just think we could have done so much better, but for your point, these influences which
You're
destroy
right
lives.
in the sense that we are the most pro-Palestinian. We are the ones trying to create a Palestinian
No one in
state.
America, people outside of Arab Americans,
Why is it
no one else
our
cares,
job to engage in state building
Right.
for the other? I don't get it. And the other thing is, just because you mentioned 2-state solution and the fact that we've woken up, we have to be really careful with our terminology because, as I mentioned before, words are everything. And, a phrase like 2-state solution, creating another Islamist state in a sea of failed dictatorships is not a solution to anything, nor would it be the first Palestinian state. They have Jordan. And then in terms of wake-up calls, I thought we had a wake-up call on 9/11, right? The world woke up to what, radical, suicide, homicidal, genocidal Islam is all about. And then we were silenced and we were intimidated and we were called Islamophobic and we were sued and we were harassed and we were assaulted and we kind of stepped back into complacency, buried our heads in the sand, and October the 7th has now woken everybody up again.
I think it's different about it is, it's an interesting question. I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and I think that for a lot of American Jews, it was what came home was something different. If you live in Ann Arbor, you live in West Bloomfield, 9/11 is in New York, right? It's not, but if it's here and your kids go to U of M and they see the encampments every day and they can't get to class because there's a protest going on, it strikes differently. When it's your kid's professor, it strikes differently because it reminds people of what anti-Semitism was. You know, for me, I'm 40, and this was the first experience I've had in my life with real anti-Semitism. It was something my grandfather talked about, right? It was something that was vaguely out there, but it wasn't something that I ever noticed and felt singled out for. This was different, and I think the way it impacted American Jews' lives, I think made it different, and I think has changed, frankly, an entire generation of young people, of young American Jews, based on what happened.
You guys are amazing. Like watching the two of you go back and forth, we could do this all night. As I mentioned before, our time is now running low. And we have a lot of questions we won't be able to answer, but they will be available outside in the lobby, and I hope we'll continue the conversation. I do really want to just thank the two of you for being here tonight. Brooke, for coming and sharing the information, for showing us how we really can end Jew hatred in our lifetimes, and to see the two of you so passionate, a next generation of people who can lead us to that place where we will no longer have to face anti-Semitism. So thank you so very much for being here tonight, and I hope that we'll continue the conversation out here in our atrium with some dessert, and thank you all so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.